Merry Meet Annie here. Welcome to the last installment of my Kyphi series, and if you have been following it live, I apologize for this horrendous delay. I just was not supposed to show you a video on the last step. The first video that I did of making the pellets at the end wouldn't upload. I tried it over a week or two and it wouldn't upload. So I delayed making the rest of my pellets and tried it again and did a new video, and it would not upload. I've never had a video that would not upload to YouTube before. So you get to the point where you go, universe, I'm listening to you. It's not supposed to be done that way. So I'm going to talk you through the last step. And it is indeed easy to talk you through. You will have arrived at the last step with all of your ingredients married together and waiting for the wet ingredients that you put together at the beginning. And here's what you do next. You take those wet ingredients and you warm them up. Bring them to a simmer. You don't want to boil them. We don't want it to be overheated. It loses too much of its essence if it's boiled. But you bring it to a simmer. Let it bubble. And emulsify it a bit. I actually, when I do mine, use one of those little emulsifiers you can stick in a pot or a glass and stir things up. That's what I use, because it's easy to make a very smooth paste out of those wet ingredients by doing that. Potato masher works good. Really anything that will emulsify it's going to work just fine. So put all of those wet ingredients that you've been saving, the wine and the mixture, put it into a pot. Bring it to a slow simmer, just barely bubbling. Add a half a cup or so of honey if you're making a very large batch, less if you're going to make a smaller batch. And let it bubble down. You want it to liquefy as a one, more or less, to come together in one big glop. Let it cool about halfway. Now, down to room temperature, maybe a little bit warmer than that. You want it to be enough liquid that it pours and moves. You don't want it to become so molasses-like that you can't manipulate it. And you're going to begin adding your dry ingredients to that. The consistency you're looking for, I best describe as the consistency of Play-Doh. So think of the Play-Doh that you played with as a child. It was just short of being dry. It was sticky, but just short of being dry. There was nothing syrupy or gooey of it. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for adding as much of the dry ingredient that you possibly can that allows the wet ingredient to keep it bound to each other, to make a goo out of it, a paste out of it. If you have more dry ingredients than you have dampness, use more honey. Just keep adding honey if you need to. A lot of pellet-based incenses, honey is the only wet ingredient. So you're not hurting anything by adding more honey if you need to make it damper. And that sometimes happens when you're making a large batch, because you're going to run out of the foundation of the liquid that you've put together with the fruits and the wine and the honey, maybe before you've run out of dry ingredients. No worries. Use honey then to make it very, very thick. Then you're going to make pellets out of it. I usually make 2-size pellets. I make what is basically a pea-sized pellet, and it's about just the end of your finger, your little finger. That works well for use in a house. These incenses, this Kyphi, because it is very resinous, it can be a bit smoky. It's a very heavy temple incense, and it can be very smoky. You don't need a big glob of that on your charcoal to burn it, because if you do, you're going to asphyxiate yourself and anybody, animal or human, that's in the room with you. So a little pea size might not seem like much, but you can always add more if you need more. But it is a good size to have for indoor rituals. And I make one about the size of my thumb. That size is a good one for outdoors. That's the goal of the size that we're going to make for these pellets. I find the easiest thing is, first thing is, wear latex or rubber gloves of some kind. The tight ones, the surgical ones, you can get those even in grocery stores for touching food without getting your hands directly on it. So grocery stores even are carrying them nowadays. Because you're dealing, when you start mushing and manipulating and making a goo out of your ingredients, a lot of those resins that you've used, not only are they very sticky, but they will give you a bit of a tattoo on your fingers for a while. So it's really good to use some kind of really tight, skin tight latex or rubber gloves when you are making the dough for your Kyphi. So then the easiest way I have found to make the pellets is I take a bit of a glob of my goo, of my paste, let's call it, and I roll it out. Roll it out. Make a snake out of it. Make it long and thin. If you're making the small ones, the width of your little finger. If you're making the larger ones, the width of your thumb. Lay it out and then chop it into little pieces. Because then you can take each one of those pieces, and it doesn't take much time then to roll it into a little pellet. Making the pellets can actually be a bit time consuming. But I found that rather than taking a touch of it and then rolling it, making the snake and chopping it into little pieces first is the easiest way to turn your pea-sized or your thumb-sized pellets into reality. You're going to have a lot of them. And I hope some of you who are making this, that were doing it live, I know you're making smaller batches. And the good thing about that is you get to experience the making of the paste without being overwhelmed with a huge batch. I had to spend hours and hours on mine because my batch was so big, because I had a lot of intention of how I was going to use it and who I was going to give it to. So, as you are making your little pellets, your pea-sized and thumb-sized pellets, lay them on wax paper on some kind of a flat pan or surface. I use cookie sheets, baking sheets. The wax paper, I've done without it, and I wished I didn't, because these are going to be very, very sticky. And on the wax paper, they won't stick. You'll be able to move them around. In the end, you're going to have a huge lineup of little pellet soldiers all lined up on the flat pans that you are using, that you've laid wax paper on. I've tried parchment paper too. It didn't work as good. Good old wax paper works the best. So there you are then, with all your little soldiers lined up. Then they need to dry. I am lucky in my house. There's a heater room in the middle of our house where I put them out on their trays to dry. So the constant heat in the winter time will dry them fairly quickly. In the summertime, it takes them a long time to dry for me because I live in a very humid climate. So you're going to have to wait and see how long it takes for yours to dry. Obviously, the pea-sized ones are going to dry before the thumb-sized ones. A week to 2 is an average time for drying when they're just sitting out in the air if it's not humid. And in my heater room, I can dry them in less than 2 weeks, but in the summertime, it can take me 2 to 3 weeks for these to dry. So you are going to only judge that based on where you live and the humidity where you are drying them. How do you know when they're dry? They're hard. They turn to little pellets. Very hard. They don't squish anymore. They're very, very hard. So here's a couple of things you can do with them at that point. The way to store these. Now you have to remember all the live ingredients we put in here. The honey and the wine. Excuse the noise in the background. There's a cement truck outside, so you're going to have to hear me over a cement truck. Hopefully you can hear me over the cement truck. Don't you just love the suburbs? The water company decided to dig up our street, so it's a little bit noisy at the moment. There you are with your pellets. How do you store them? You would have been, and I should have mentioned this, as they were drying, and that's why it's important, they are on that wax paper. Every now and then, take your hand over them and move them so they get a little bit different. You know how when you're sometimes cooking things and you want to turn them so that another side gets browned? It's just like that. Every now and then move them so a different side's on the bottom. That way they dry a little bit more evenly. I don't have to put gloves on to do that. I can actually do that with my hand and not have too much trouble. So when you have decided they are dry, which you can only really do by pinch test, take it between your hands and see how easy does it give. If it gives at all, it needs more time to dry. So, 2 things you can do with them at this point. You can save the pellets. And the way to save your pellets is to put them in an airtight container. I use glass containers with lids, and add some powdered incense to it. Something pure. You don't want to put a mixture in. What you're doing is you're creating a powder that will then, when you shake it up, go between them and keep them from sticking to each other. Otherwise, if you go to take them out, you end up with some huge glob of Kyphi pellets, and that's not what you're aiming for. You should be able to comfortably take a pellet out when you want it later. So all you have to do is add a dry ingredient. You're not adding a lot. You're adding just enough dry ingredient so that when you shake them about, they've got a little bit of a covering on them. Think about it when you're flouring a chicken before you put it in the pan, that kind of thing. So then you can keep that. Store your pellets, the small or the large, both that way. They don't keep forever. And And they do have to be absolutely airtight because they will grow mold. Oh, I found that out the hard way after spending a lot of time on expensive ingredients earlier in my career as a witch. I learned something in that case. They got all fuzzy on me. 2 mistakes probably in that case. I didn't let them dry long enough. Now I'm going to make sure they are rock solid. And the other thing is I kept them in plastic bags, the baggies, and I don't think that was airtight enough. It didn't work as well as jars with tight lids have worked for me. The fun thing about the dry ingredient that you're going to use is you can further decide how you want to use your Kyphi pellets by the dry ingredient that you put in them. I like to, when I'm making them for gifts, I like to, add a dry ingredient that represents the person to me. So if there's a certain element that reminds me of them, and I have a spice or an herb or botanical that represents that, or if I know they have a favorite thing. Say I have a friend that just is a freak for patchouli, and I want to individualize and personalize the gift of Kyphi I'm giving them. I will grind patchouli up to a fine, fine powder, and I will use that in the jar of the Kyphi that I'm giving them. For myself, I line up a couple different Kyphi uses where I will use benzoin, which is the most common of the botanicals used as the powder to keep Kyphi from sticking to itself. Benzoin powder. And that is my temple version of this. But I will line it up also with other intents when I jar them for myself. When I want something personal out of it, I want meditation, I want something deeply personal in the work I'm doing with it, those are stored with lavender powder separating the Kyphi pellets. So I have different things that I coat it with according to setting up a little extra intent of how I will use it. I end up with a shelf of not only my Kyphi, the basic recipe, but Kyphi that I intend to use for certain things. And then what happens is when you put that pellet on a charcoal, the first burst you get is going to be what you put on the outside of it. So you get a quick sense of the essence of what you established it to be. And then the heaviness of the Kyphi then grows and blooms and comes out of that. That's something I've always done. Traditionally, benzoin is what Kyphi is stored in. And again, I'm reminding you, it's enough powder just to shake around it so that you're flouring it in a sense and making it just so it doesn't stick to itself. And this is done both for the small and the large pellets. About 6 months is the most that you can store your Kyphi for. 2 things start to happen. The first thing is it will eventually, because it's a bit alive, it will start getting a little too organic again. And also, over time, I have found it just loses that potency that you have when you first create it, and it becomes something different at the end. So using it within 6 months is a good idea. Now, another thing you can do with your Kyphi. All that work that you've done, you have your pellets, but maybe you're not a pellet person if you haven't worked with, and I do suggest you try the pellets if you never have. It's my favorite way of burning incense. Pellets can be burned on charcoal directly. They can be burned on incense trails. You put on top of the rice ash. According to the nature of your particular Kyphi, they're all touchy. They can also be burnt on a mica tray on top of a charcoal, which of course is a less smoky way of burning incense. Some of them burn really good that way, but some of the batches I've had have not, so I have to discover different batches how they work. But maybe you're a powdered incense freak. That is what you like to be able to do, is just add exactly how much you want when you want. So let me first say that the pellets of Kyphi, if you have had enough smoke for the time being, you can just push the pellet off the charcoal or take it off with your incense tongue, put it back on again later if you want to. But if you are a powder lover, that's how you like your incense. When your iffy-tiffy, how about when your Kyphi is completely dry? You can break up and grind up that Kyphi. Then you have the benefit of having all the dry ingredients and the energy of those in with the wet ingredients, but all dried together, and then you can re-powder them, and it can be powdered incense. A lot of the Kyphi that you buy online is that way, mostly because once it's broken down that way, I think it lasts longer. So you could store it in a bottle perhaps for a longer time. Although I have broken down Kyphi and gone to open it several months later and found that there was something growing in it, which may have been it wasn't dry enough. It may have been the nature of the Kyphi. So in the end, you will have small pellets and large pellets, and you can also make really good sized pellets out of this. If you are doing something outside where you know you want a lot of smoke, I tend to stick with the pea-sized and the thumb-sized Kyphi. I like to powder some of it too. I like to keep it in jars just so I can grab a pinch whenever I want to. I sometimes, when I'm working with any incense and doing a working, feel the need to make it of greater import for some reason. I want to focus of greater power. So I give it a zap by putting just a toof of my Kyphi powder on it, no matter what I had been burning previously. Just my way. It's just something I do with it. I hope that you will let me know, if you are trying this, how it worked out for you. There is something I have been wanting to try, which someone told me about, and I have not tried it, and I want to. And I've kept out some of the dry ingredients of the Kyphi that I recently made, and I'm going to try this because I made so much. If it doesn't work, I won't feel I've lost anything. So I'll report back later on whether it worked. But a friend of mine told me she heard of someone, so a friend heard. So that's how we have to experiment then to see, was it really so, that by lining a cookie sheet with parchment paper, adding your pellets, and putting your Kyphi in your stove, if you have a stove that can go down to a very low heat. So you don't want a gas stove, or if you could turn it down as far as it'll go, you're in danger of it turning itself off and then gas getting into your house. Some electric stoves will go down very, very low, and some won't. Mine does. And what my friend told me she had heard was someone who mixed their Kyphi by putting it on parchment paper, on cookie sheets, and uses the lowest setting in her stove. And I think really it has to be in there for quite some time. So there must be a knack then of learning the point at which it is as dried as it needs to be without it being so dry that you start disturbing and ruining the essences within it. I want to try that because I can't make Kyphi successfully over the summertime because it's too damp here. And that would certainly solve the problem. So those of you who are explorers in new territory, especially if you made a large batch and you want to try that, I'll be trying it too when I get a chance, so we can let each other know how it worked out. So again, my friends, I apologize for the fact there wasn't a video to go with this. I hope I explained it well enough that you know how to make the pellets. It's no different than making any traditional pellet incense that you are using a wine or honey base and adding your dry ingredients to it. I think the only thing I probably do slightly different is making the snake that I then cut in little pieces then to make my pellets. And I also think that the thing that I do differently from traditional is storing them with different dry powders so that I then give a oomph of meaning to each of the different jars of my Kyphi on how I want them to be used in my workings, or to personalize them when I give them to somebody that I have put in this particular item representing you, and you are now part of that Kyphi recipe that I made. If you have any questions on this series, if you would be kind enough to send them to me or make a comment on this video, if I need to do a wrap-up video, I will gladly. And several of you have asked me, do I have something in writing that I can send you that is a list of the recipe and how you make it? Indeed I do. It's not really pretty, it's my own notes, they're kind of scratchy, but it'll help if you need that. So drop me an email to my YouTube account and I will gladly send that to you. It's not going to be pretty, but it'll be enough for you to go on if that's what you want to add to your collection. For those of you who have been making this as we have gone along, please know I am terribly sorry for the fact that life got a little bit in the way, and then technology got seriously in the way and shifted how this series would end and delayed it. I can't wait to hear how some of your Kyphi turned out. I'm especially interested in the things that you tried, what you did differently, so that I have new things to play with. Blessings to you all, and may you, when you burn your Kyphi, have a little bit of an understanding of the history that you were part of. And imagine you are on a wild mountaintop with nothing around you but nature, making your offering to the sky. Imagine you are in the depths of a temple where daylight hardly ever reaches and you're making an offering of your Kyphi. Think of all the hands over time that have put their energy and focus into making something which is the essence of the gods, a supreme offering throughout so many cultures and so many times, and you are one with that when you make your own version of Kyphi. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Merry part.